and guess what? There were Muslims, there were Christians, and there were Jews.
Exactly.
So it's literally a huge fat contradiction.
That's
they use that kind of SIM
exactly.
card. It's getting old and repetitive.
You breathing in and out of my.
Assalamu alaikum. Hi. How are you, Bayan?
I'm great. How are you, Najeen?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. Are you excited?
I'm very excited for our first episode.
Yeah. So my name is Lejane, and this is our first episode of this amazing podcast. In this talk, we're gonna just talk about important things, raise awareness, just have raw discussions, and that brings me to bringing awareness to the first thing. So why don't you, Bayan, tell us more about what happened in the recent attack of Canada?
So the past week in Canada hasn't been easy on the whole community, actually, and especially the Muslim community. And for people who don't know, basically on a Sunday evening, a family, I think there were 5 of them, walking, and like literally 3 generations, like a grandma, like parents, and 2 kids, and they were brutally run over by a 20-year-old white supremacist who targeted them for their Muslim faith, and all 4 were pronounced dead, and the only boy left is a 9-year-old boy without his family. So it's been really rough for like the whole community, and we even there's kind of been a fear of like even going out for us Muslims, but there is a little bit of a silver lining that the whole community has come together, and a whole lot of COVID restrictions have been lifted up, so we can come together in solidarity. So obviously there's a lot more to go, like in terms of justice and putting in the right policies, and even in terms of coverage, between like when a white
I think it deserves, alhamdulillah, people are talking about it, but I think it deserves much more media coverage. And just imagine what would have happened if the roles were switched.
So true.
Yeah, so may Allah accept them as shuhada. And that brings us to the topic of this episode, the one and only Palestine.
So before we get into the current events that are happening, let's just have a quick history recap for the people who are new here, and super quick
crash course.
Yeah, crash course real quick. So recently I've actually read this book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, so you guys should definitely give it a read. It's on Amazon, it's also on Kindle, so it'll give you way more in depth of the history, but just briefly, after World War I, obviously Palestine was under the British mandate, and the issue was that the British had promised Palestinian sovereignty over their own land, like how they gave other Arab sovereignty, like Egypt and other Arab countries, but at the same time they promised a Jewish homeland for the Jews in Palestine. So they kind of made 2 promises at the same time, and then at one point they just went, bye, the UN's gonna deal with this. So the UN was only literally 2 years old at the time, and they were like, okay, let's split the land. And obviously Palestinians weren't happy about this, and even one of the historians actually said that the native people of Palestine, the native people of America, Europe, wherever, refused to split their land with a settler community. And he has a point, if settlers are coming, refugees, ahlan wa sahlan, welcome, but to just give half of your land to them, it's wait, you can live in my land, but what's this going on? So obviously there were a lot of protests, and once the British left, the Zionists took matters into their own hands, basically, and went, we need to take this land by force, and we're gonna literally cleanse all the cities and make it our own. So they started this Plan D, which is basically the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and they went into each village, into major cities like Haifa, and I think it's called Jaffa in English, Jaffa, different cities, and they basically slaughtered the Palestinians in cold blood. They expelled 800,000 Palestinians had to flee their home, and it may not seem like a big number compared to the big world population today, but it was huge, because that was more than half of their population at the time. And all of this happened without any notice from the history. It's been completely erased from the minds of the international community.
The Jewish forces, later on the Israeli forces, were systematically expelling the Palestinians from their homes, fields, and businesses. It's not expelling one village, it's not destroying one town, it's not throwing out 100 people, 1,000 people from their houses. It is a decision to uproot a whole country.
So, yeah,
Thank
that's
you, yeah.
very tragic.
It's devastating.
Yeah. And Najee, if you can kind of go over the recent events and what's been happening to this day.
Thank you for sharing about this history, because honestly, I've only learned this just less than a year ago. Yani, I've been a Palestinian my whole life. It is the truth. Some people, it's okay that you can be ignorant sometimes, but you have to step up and just educate yourself about this. So what's happening now? There's a lot been going on now, but I think let's start by talking about the beautiful ceasefire, the amazing ceasefire. So, Bayan, remember how we were planning to record this episode for a few weeks? And something that I specifically wanted to bring up is how they announced a ceasefire and how it's obviously a lame trick, one of their biggest tricks. And after the unfortunate, disgusting rockets that scarred Gaza, Allah yarhamhum ya Rab, I just wanted to say, not even 24 hours after they announced that ceasefire, they literally attacked Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's for first, okay? And they fired rubber bullets, tear gases, sound grenades at worshippers. Okay, literally, not even 24 hours after that. But now, as of 17th of June, less than a month from the ceasefire, they fired airstrikes targeting more than 10 sites in Gaza. Yani, I'm just saying, man, this is one of the hundreds of crimes they violate, and it just proves that we should never calm down just because they announce a ceasefire or whatever,
So true.
Relax, we should keep going. We should just keep going.
Yeah, and the racism still continues. The march that happened, where literally Israelis have been literally calling death to the Arabs. A second Nakba is coming, and in case you don't know what Nakba is, it's basically the catastrophe in 1948 where basically the Palestinians were transferred out of their homes by force, and they're oh, we're coming back and you guys are going to be refugees again.
وخلال أسابيع تمكنت المنظمات اليهودية العسكرية من إحكام سيطرتها على الأراضي التي خصصها قرار التقسيم للدولة اليهودية، واحتلال نصف الأراضي التي خصصها القرار للدولة العربية.
And that brings us to hiding the face of the devil.
So true. Yeah. And what bugs me the most, actually, Jane, it's that whenever anyone stands up for Palestinian rights or brings these issues, like Sheikh Jarrah, the destruction of homes and the marches and all the racism that's going on, and brings it to the table, they're oh, you're anti-Semitic. And it's just what? How is that? Let's just debunk
so
anti-Semitism for a second. Jane, do you have any thoughts on just that whole notion that you're just anti-Semitic if you stand up for basic human rights?
Well, first of all, I do believe they have a sort of a toxic relationship with the tool of victimization of themselves. They distract people from the clear as ice crimes, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the murdering, the imprisonment of innocent children. And the list can go on for days, but they basically they use that as a card. They give you that card, the anti-Semitic card, and let me just say, if we were actually anti-Semitic, there would have never been peace. And one day, much before 1948, there was peace, okay? The day Palestine was for Palestinians, and guess what? there were Muslims, there were Christians, and there were Jews.
Exactly.
So it's literally a huge fat contradiction.
That's
they use that kind of SIM
exactly.
card. It's
throw
getting
it out.
old and repetitive.
When the missiles were being fired, he was messaging us that he and his wife were okay in their tiny, safe room. His dog was totally distressed.
Your son's dog was scared. There are children who were massacred and slaughtered.
Thinking about why this whole anti-Semitism argument just falls on its face, that Arabs are actually Semitic. Like, Arabic is a Semitic language. So the fact that literally they're calling death to the Arabs, and the fact that there's over, like, I think 65 Israeli laws that are discriminatory towards Palestinians, like, that's anti-Semitic, and we should be addressing that too. The fact that it's still there today shows something about the international community, that you're actually anti-Semitic because you want them out. And that was the whole reason that it was made. And it just, how can they pull that anti-Semitic card when the whole state, the whole idea of it is anti-Semitic?
And I consider nothing more despicable than to use their suffering and their martyrdom to try to justify the torture, the brutalization, the demolition of homes that Israel daily commits against the Palestinians. So I refuse any longer to be intimidated or browbeaten by the tears. If you had any heart in you, you would be crying for the Palestinians.
Alhamdulillah, the world has never been this vocal about Palestine before. And what started off Aslan was the town Sheikh Jarrah.
So in Sheikh Jarrah, it's a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem has been recognized as occupied territories by the UN. So literally, like, Jewish settlers don't have any right to be there, but they're basically going in and literally taking people's homes. Like, I've seen a house where, like, Jewish settlers are literally living in the room in your house. Like, how is that even, like, a thing, you know? So obviously, like, Palestinians have been protesting, like, you know, anyone would protest. Someone just comes into your house and lives there with no right, you know? The least you could do is maybe give them another house somewhere else, but no, you just leave them homeless. And it's obviously sparked a lot of protests, and that's been faced, like you said, Dejane, with stun grenades. People are being wounded for just the freedom of speech, the freedom to protest. And then with Silwan too, the people have, there's been, I think, demolitions, and they're like basically sending letters and saying, oh, here's a couple days to bulldoze your home, and if you don't, we'll do it for you, you know, no worries, but you'll just pay the cost of the destruction. What? Like, that's just, ugh.
They're literally, I feel like they have a little addiction issue of playing the angel of mercy role, and inside they just hide the devil face. Like, it's actually so hard to see, especially on the mainstream media. Like, if you just like Fox or BBC, if you just follow these, it's so hard to see the truth sometimes.
So hard.
The Luntz document spells out which talking points have been most effective in spinning the brutal reality of Palestinian casualties. He says the first thing the pro-Israeli spokespeople should do is to express empathy for the innocent victims.
Unfortunately, innocents do get hurt, and we really grieve that.
We're sad for every civilian casualty.
Then Luntz tells PR spokespeople to turn the tables and ask the American people, what would you do?
So what would you do in the United States?
Can you imagine what America would do if it were facing a similar threat?
We always try to ask you the question we ask ourselves. What will you do?
What would you do?
What would you do?
When we say, what does it mean, being an anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic?
So anti-Semitic, and obviously there's many different Semitic groups. Like you said, even Arabs are Semitic, but if you're just specifically talking about anti-Jewish, it's that you're against Jews just because they're Jews, because of their bloodline or their religion, what they believe in, and that's wrong. We completely refuse that. And like you said, like, Palestinians lived with Jews, Christians, Muslims for long periods of time, and we never had problems with Jews, you know? It was actually like Europe and the countries that today they're saying that all the Arab countries are like anti-Semitic. They're the ones that were anti-Semitic throughout history.
They literally did the Holocaust.
They did exactly. Whereas Zionism is basically this movement for an exclusively Jewish state, which basically means that the moment Arabs become more than 20% or even more than 10% in the Jewish state, they become a threat to this whole idea of Zionism, that there needs to be a state just for Jewish people. So that means that the moment, because Arabs have more kids, statistically, so the moment they start to exceed and the Jewish majority idea is under threat, so they'll arrest, they'll transfer them to other countries, they'll kill them, it's just ethnic cleansing continuing. And we're just against this idea that, like, the anti-Zionism idea that, if you're not Jew, you're not a Jew, then you don't deserve to live, or you don't get to live on this land because you're not a Jew. And we need to, like, address that, the fact that, like, the same way that discriminating against Jews and wanting them out of the country is wrong is the same way that a non-Jew wanting a non-Jew out of the country and, like, hating a non-Jew for not being Jewish is wrong too. They're both wrong.
Exactly. So one last thing about this topic, I want to say that since there are a lot of, like, propaganda going on and, like, it's sometimes hard to seek truth, I think the biggest advice I could give you, or anyone at least, when you want to seek out for truth, seek people who live inside Palestine and who are specifically Palestinian. These people, I'm gonna, inshallah, will be inserting Instagram usernames that you could follow, because it gets very distracting, gets very confusing when you're just following mainstream media or somebody who's completely biased about this topic.
I think that we both kind of struggle with this, but I just wanted to bring it as well, because even I follow a bunch of Palestinian accounts, people who live in Palestine, and sometimes I just sit there for hours just scrolling through and seeing the atrocities that are happening, and even when we, like, follow those accounts, I think there's also a healthy balance between, like, scrolling for hours about, like, on Palestinian news and also being educated. It's such a hard balance, because you don't want to ignore, and, like, even hours out of my day, of course, like, people are living through this, like, I should be there, side by side with them, but it gets to a point where your mental health just, like, you can't go on with your day, and you don't want to ignore it, but you also, like, it's such a hard balance. I don't know if you have any, like, tips on how to stay balanced, I guess, in terms of, like, seeking out the truth, but not overwhelming yourself.
Exactly, yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think that brings us, what keeps us going. And one of the things that I struggle with, I get that load of, like, just scrolling and, like, getting too deep into the media, and then sometimes I kind of feel numb or, like, kind of unaffected, because I don't empathize with them, or I don't feel like I'm not going through this, so this does not affect me much. And I think that people need to address that, just because you're not going through it, or just because you don't relate to it, does not mean you can completely ignore it and just raise awareness or, like, fight for things that matter to you only. It's a human right thing.
It's a human right, yeah, exactly. Affects every single human. Like, if one part of, like, human history is, struggling, we need to all be there for them, and it's just basically people are
about that,
بصيت من البلكونه واتخضيت من كميه الناس اللي بتدعم القضيه، ومش هنا وبس، ده هنا وهنا 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 وهنا
تاريخي ومعتقداتي عبثا تحاول لا فناء لثائر أنا
وهنا فلسطين حرة بيكم.
And recently I've actually started a journal just for, like, Palestinian issues and, like, reading books and going through articles. And I think something that helped me too is start having the first page be an intention and reading that every day before you start researching, because it can get a little bit overwhelming, like, when you're reading about all these issues and then, like, scrolling through things, like, without any intention, and you just, this is, like, overwhelming, I'm gonna stop, or you leave it for days and you don't, like, visit it. So I basically have, like, a page of, like, my intention for it, and my main intention actually is that I need to do something about this, because on the day of judgment, we're going to be asked about what we did for the Muslims that were struggling, and there has to be something you fight for in this life and that you stand for. Like, you can't just go on your whole life letting injustices happen around you and doing nothing. Like, that's the point of life, to like rise up and stand up. And the same way, like, Prophet Moses, and I think Christians and Jews and Muslims can all like relate to this, he stood up against the Pharaoh. And even though it was such a big, you know, superpower, and like it was so intimidating, but he stood up against the Pharaoh. And that's one of the biggest forms of standing up for injustice, to like just, you know, stand up and raise awareness and bring this issue to light, even when it's scary. So that's kind of like what I'm having in mind, that I need to stand up for it, because that's the whole point of life, to make sure that you stand up for those injustices and not let them go by.
Yeah, standing up for is I feel like every act of standing up is an act of like resistance. And for our last part of this amazing episode, we want to just discuss a few things that we could do that will help the movement keep going, just keep going and never stop. You know, what I heard that day is like, free Palestine until Palestine is actually free. You know,
so true.
It's not just like a quote, like a cute Tumblr or like free Palestine.
Cute profile picture for a month.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a trend, you know. It's something that there are actual people, like it's sometimes it's hard to like empathize because you're not dealing with it, but there are actual people dealing with this, and you just have to start by doing whatever. And I think the biggest thing, but also simultaneously the smallest thing, is praying for them, making dua, praying for strength, praying for the victory, and praying for patience for us and the Palestinians in Palestine, and to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised us this victory in the Quran. And I think that is something really, really strong to stick by with.
Yeah, and also to add on to that, like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised us victory, but it also needs to come with our effort. You know, like, you know, tie your camel and then tawakkal ala Allah. So like, a lot of people are like, oh, Jerusalem will be freed, and then we all just like sit there, like, you remember, when is it gonna be freed?
Yeah.
So we need to also do our part. And speaking of doing your part, the next point is to just never stop resharing and even making your own posts, raising awareness about Palestine and what you learn, because media has such a big power, and the fact that like Israel is still continuing to deactivate accounts, and like, you know, this needs to be taken down, this needs to, and like Facebook is actively, and like Instagram, and we can't let this like censorship and like them silencing us stop us from keep going, because it's showing them like there's like a big resistance, you know, they're like, stop sharing, we're like, no, we're sharing, like, you know. So we have to keep doing it.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, media to them is the hugest threat right now. It's the hugest threat. If a rock cannot threaten them, then the media will absolutely destroy them. And it's just the beginning. Come on, like, you know what happened to Al Jazeera? They literally like bombed the whole building. Like, it had like Al Jazeera offices. What they did to that reporter that day,
they broke her arm. Did you?
Yeah, it was. What the hell was that? Like, of course, and Al Jazeera speaks for truth, so it means something, you know. And another thing that I was doing the other day was that rate and review on App Store. It's so important, or Google Play, whatever it is. It actually made a difference, because Facebook literally contacted Apple and told them to remove the reviews or the ratings, because it went down, like completely down, and they started losing. Obviously that threatens them. TikTok, Instagram and Facebook, all they're trying to do is just mute pro-Palestinian voices. And one last thing is Google Maps. Write a review and rate on App Store or Google Play to put Palestine on the damn map, please.
Exactly. Oh my. Another point too is like using the right keywords, and I honestly, even like my family, they also use that, like, oh yeah, there was a war in Gaza. There was no war, like, it's not balanced.
Excuse me.
Yeah. And like even our own families and like even Palestinians themselves, it comes across their mind that like, yeah, the Israel-Palestine conflict, or like there's clashes going on, and there are no clashes.
It's the easier choice.
There are children with rocks, and there are militaries that are backed up by billions of dollars, and there's no match at all. We can't keep continuing to call them like wars and conflicts, because they're not equal at all. There's an oppressor and there's oppressed, and we need to like really use the right keywords. So some words we can use is like occupation, the ethnic cleansing, you know, basically genocide that's happening there, and write out oppression, honestly, like just calling it out for what it is and avoid using those words.
Yeah, I think the words we use are very powerful, and they basically change the way we view things. So if we continue to call it a war casually like that, or like a conflict, people will think it's a conflict. That's why there are people that are still biased about this. And I think another thing is boycotting. Boycotting is a big time effective boycotting when we all target the same companies. I read that day that the same way donations help in times of crisis, payments towards companies that support Israel are helping the crimes against inhumanity.
That's such a great point. And it will definitely, like, once you get into their pocket, they're gonna start to like, okay, so we need to stop funding those. Another point too is to be emotionally supportive towards the people who are active on this topic and who are Palestinians, and just standing in solidarity with them, sending them like words of encouragement, because it must, like, the fact that it's hard for us to watch these news, imagine like seeing them, you know, like it's just a whole other level. So just being there for people, sending like messages and things like that.
And it makes a big difference. And I think that brings us to our last point, which is the hugest point. Is basically whatever you have, man, whatever you have, whatever skill you have, how much you belittle it, or like how much you think of it as a big thing, use it. Whatever it is, speaking, writing, filming, like I don't know, singing, whatever it is, use it. Use it to the benefit of justice. Use it to the benefit of humanity. If we just continue day by day, one day we will see it. One day we will see Palestine free.
A free Palestine.
Basically, free Palestine. Peace. So guys, thank you so much for watching our first episode. Please stay tuned for the upcoming ones. And thank you, Bayan, for being with me here and doing this episode.
Thank you, Shayan. Such a great conversation, and we hope to see you in the next one.